Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you so much for tuning into one of our talks today. We are a year-round talk series bringing you the best creative voices across film, television, and theater. And I'm so excited today to be joined by the fantastically talented writer and director, Iram Parveen Bilal, whose film I'll Meet You There is a really stunning character exploration between these three generations. And when you were mapping it out and coming up with these three characters, I was interested in the initial choice to make it three generations because that gives so many other layers of richness and the different dynamics that you can craft beyond them. Was it always something when you first came up with the initial conception that that was going to be the case for that reason?
Thank you. Thank you, Mara, for having me. It's actually a very interesting question because I kind of had to fight for it to be a dual protagonist or multi-protagonist story because, everyone from my mentors at Film Independence, Writers Lab, to whoever, everybody was like, just simplify, make it one character, as in like one protagonist. But to me, from the beginning, it was so much more about the community and I just felt like both Majid and Dua's journeys were so equally interesting to me. In fact, everybody thinks I identify with Dua more because she's female, but I actually identify more with Majid, the middle-aged Muslim cop, because he's the one who left his, sort of country and was the first zeroth generation, so to speak. So to answer your question, it has been from the get-go very intentional to make it multi-generational. Also in terms of just accessing and targeting multi-generations. We often see, sort of the young generation and oh my God, are terribly like old school parents. We see that narrative. What we don't see is the parents' point of view as well. And then sort of like the people coming from the old country. So it was an effort to really try and understand different ideologies and viewpoints and what it means to be an immigrant, really. Like, how is identity? It was kind of like trying to show a snapshot of identity evolution in immigration.
Mhm. And even to the point about the way that you sometimes see certain characters in certain stories, with this, I love the exploration of Dua, and she's discovering what religion means to her and through the eyes of her dad. But so traditionally, it's like, okay, the young woman who hasn't been allowed to do certain things, but with her, it's the opposite. It's like she's had all the freedoms. We see her come home drunk, and it's not a huge deal with her dad because of the dynamic between them. What are the ways in which you really wanted to just construct a narrative through her that was so different to the way that we often see characters like hers in movies?
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. I'm kind of over the notion of the oppressed Muslim woman. And I feel that that narrative has been sort of supported to be told out there so much that I wanted to put forward something we haven't seen, which exists, and having like a great relationship with your father or having, an unexpected Muslim family. And also the notion was, these people happen to be Muslim. It's not that that is all their identity is, right? So I feel often when we're trying to create BIPOC narratives now, I more than ever, I feel that we need to be consciously authentic, as well as I think the more authentic and specific we are, the more relatable the experiences are and universal they are. So in this film, hopefully you watch this film and you want to call your grandfather or your father or your daughter, and you want to walk out of it and be like, that's just like my family. Yeah, sure, they happen to be Muslim. So this was very conscious in my mind. I really wanted to kind of focus in on the relationships, and then the Islam and the identity and the politics came later.
And with that authenticity, this wasn't the first film that you've made, but it was the first script that you ever started writing. So you've really been gestating on this for over 10 years at this point before you went into production. And you've talked a little bit about how throughout the years you kept rewriting certain elements and finessing them because you always wanted it to feel really present to today. And in particular, the film is, and you've mentioned this, at its core, an exploration of what it means to be Muslim in a post 9/11 America. And what are the aspects of that that have shifted and evolved within the script? But also, what are some of the details that have remained the same because people think that everybody's moved on, but the country hasn't?
Yeah, no. Again, great question. It is in some ways, everybody's for 10 years has been saying it's so timely, right? It's almost like I wish it wasn't timely because the issues, the social politics around it have remained. In some ways, the Trump era and the post-Trump era is a really good time for a film like this to come because I feel like before that there were still questions of if Islamophobia really exists in this country and in the world. And after the Trump era, I think it's just kind of obvious that yes, it exists. So the things that have changed, I would say, is I feel that the wider audience has become more comfortable and ready and willing to watch a Muslim protagonist story. I felt like, if we actually made the film 7 years ago, we might not have had the sort of wide audience we're getting, and we might not have had the separation from, the 9/11 events to actually, um, you know, uh, kind of engage with the material. We also have had like what the Muslim community has been saying forever. Like, we've had like new faces of domestic terrorism. So I think that the separation of Islam and terrorism, like all of that there has been enough gestation on those topics to actually just see the material for what it is, which is a human story. Within the Muslim community, I think a lot has happened too. After, a lot of people like, don't understand that what 9/11 did to the Muslim community, because the spotlight was so on us that everybody wanted to be like, well, what type of Muslim are you? I would walk into a room and immediately people would look at me like I was an expert on Islam. And I was like, wait a minute, no, I want to figure this out on my own time and pace. Like everybody figures out religion, but you had to be an expert. And so within the Muslim community, there has been a lot of quote unquote, like a Protestant movement or like a born again movement, right? And that is also kind of highlighted in this film, that we're all constantly evolving and growing, and there's no one Muslim or there's no one American and there's no one anything, and that is exactly why we need to kind of sit back, empathize, and not judge and coexist.
Right. And that's also why I think it's so wonderful that so much of the exploration of Dua's character is her questioning all of that. And what type of Muslim has she been? What type does she want to be? And actually wanted to ask specifically about the moments throughout the film where you have her reading passages of the Quran, because you really use that to enhance the internal dialogue that she's having with herself. So what was that journey of selecting which were the passages that you wanted, and also in working with her on what you wanted the tonal delivery to be when you were recording those voiceover moments?
Oh, so, I was very sensitive about what passages I chose. So obviously these are passages I myself in my life have, interacted and thought on. And then we had Islamic scholars and various Islamic scholars also kind of read the script and give us their perspective. And so that was, it was the most sensitively done part, I think, of the film. And with Dua, honestly, the actor Nikita Tivani, I almost sometimes I don't feel she needs direction. She just understands. So I guess the direction there really was just as personal as possible, and just question the things that you would question normally, and in an effort to try and learn and understand. So yeah, it is. The film is very personal in a lot of ways too.
There's also a lovely exploration with her character's relationship with dance, being, which we mentioned before, being something that she's always had the freedom to do, but now she's wondering whether she should continue with that and what it means to her in different ways. When you were choreographing the different scenes for her with that, how did you think about the different stories that you wanted to tell? Because there's a very different approach to the choreography and how she's approaching it herself, whether it's that she's finally sharing this with her grandfather, who she didn't even tell at the beginning, whether she's auditioning for Juilliard, or whether she's there dancing with her mother in her mind.
So we had a fantastic choreographer in Farah Yasmin Sheikh, who also plays the mother, and the body double. But Nikita is fantastic. So she's been trained in Kathak for 10 years. And so the collaboration was way even before we had cast the character. So Farah was working on these tunes and choreographing, but it was very, they had to be an aspect of the choreography that showed that a ballerina was doing Kathak. And so there were certain parts that were fusion. We also tried to, in the camera language, really make the audience feel that there is an element of spirituality when she dances. So you will see that the scenes that are shot in the mosque and the scenes that are shot in her dance studio, that there's a certain sort of movement and elevation of the spirit that happens in both those film scenes. So yes, there was a lot of everything from choreography to camera language, and it evolved. It starts from ballet towards Kathak, so it evolves through the film. And when the mother comes, it's pure freedom and joy. That's all it is. So, but
I also wanted to talk a little bit about the father-daughter relationship and working with Nikita and Farhan on what that dynamic was going to be, because there's so many unique aspects given that, you know, she's lost her mom, he's lost his wife, and so they have this shared grief with each other. And also they're the only members of each other's direct family for each other, which in of itself creates a different type of intimacy between the two of them. So what was that journey in working with the two of them and just figuring out the really unique aspects because of all of those elements?
So, all three actors actually, also to mention the legendary actor Muhammad Kavi Khan, who plays Baba, and who was quote unquote the antagonist of the film, and everybody comes out watching being like, I love Baba. So the three of them actually, Nikita, Farhan, and Baba, formed such a natural bond, I mean, in the cast. So we had a lot of in-character. So I had an in-character dinner. We had a lot, our rehearsals were just, going through the scenes and talking about the backstory and the relationships. And Farhan has a daughter, and so I think he was drawing a lot from his real life experiences. And Nikita has a very great relationship with her father, so there was a lot to work from there as well. And a side note is that Farhan actually became an actor, which I found out later after casting Kavi Khan. He became an actor growing up in Pakistan because of Kavi Khan, who then plays his dad in this film. So the family, quite honestly, Mara, we just cast them and they were magic. So I think big shout out also to casting directors, Sunday Bowling and Meg Morman, for their fantastic job in finding someone like Nikita. It truly was. I mean, long after the set was over, I was getting texts from all actors being like, "We miss set, we miss you guys." So it was special.
And Ferran does such a beautiful job in conveying the different things that he's really holding on to in so many of the other scenes throughout the film as well, because, you know, he holds on to a lot of guilt beyond just the element of grief. So did the two of you have many conversations about how you really wanted to capture that in a lot of moments throughout the film?
We actually did, and thank you for bringing that. One of the most important things for me is authenticity to language. And Baba and Majid, Farhan Tahir and Muhammad Kabi Khan and we had long discussions. And I, being the writer director, I was just open. I was like, listen, if dialogue doesn't work for you, tell me right away. We were very intentional in the use of Urdu throughout, because a choice for Farhan to use Urdu with his dad is actually a choice of identity very clearly in the film. So because they both understand English. So when Baba chooses to speak English and when Farhan chooses to speak Urdu is a very sort of intentional choice. So just in working with those moments, I think, and just translating the script with them as well, and just running the translations by them. From language, we took a lot of cue of loyalty in the relationship and history. And it's so interesting when you're working with prose, you just need to give one, tonal, almost like an a cappella thing. Like, okay, we're doing this here. And they just bring in all the backstory and the baggage with them.
Yeah. And with the character of Margid, he's in the show, the movie as a police officer, and then he is asked ultimately to investigate his own community, and it becomes a case that the FBI are also involved in. Did you have to do certain elements of research just to understand what that behind the scenes bureaucracy would be? When would the FBI step in? When would they allow him to go off on his own? And what all those details would be to ensure that it had that authenticity as well that you keep mentioning?
I know, absolutely. And, actually, that's a harder part of it because you don't really have access to a lot of that. But since the script has been in works for a while, I have shadowed, police officers, and I've read up on a lot of the stuff. Like one of the films that we're giving a shout out to during our live digital events is The Feeling of Being Watched, which is Asia Bandawi's documentary. Which is essentially about the FBI surveilling this Muslim community, this neighborhood in Chicago. So you kind of like build on all these pieces and the articles and you read about sort of what is happening in the community. One of the personal actually experiences that I had that kind of inspired me to write this film was when I was in college. And this was like 5-6 years after 9/11. An Iranian American friend of mine, her father was picked up from the mosque after morning prayers, and he was in prison for 2 years. And then the case was just that he had incorrectly filed his taxes. And this was the Patriot Act in its crudest form that had hit that close to home to me. And then some of my male classmates on the East Coast would get calls in the dorm room from the FBI. So we kind of felt the tentacles, in the community. So this wasn't just coming out of nowhere. This was coming from very lived and not lived, but at least like next to lived experiences. But yes, And now through the years, people would say, oh, would this really happen? And now we have enough documentaries and, cases and facts that show that, yes, it has happened and it continues to happen.
It's also so interesting that you set the film in Chicago, because it is one of those metropolitan cities that on the surface has an air of progressiveness to it, but there's always huge undercurrents of racism that do exist, even if people just visiting and going on holiday or vacation there for 2 weeks, like they don't see that. But when you live there, there's a very different atmosphere. So why was it so specifically Chicago?
It was important to shoot the film in not in LA or San Francisco or New York, but actually in a city that is closer to Main Street America, but is still diverse enough that you would have all these communities living there. And, just having family in Chicago, and just seeing the area, there's still a lot of community segregation there. Also, like the obvious choice for, a lot of producers was that we should set the story in New York because we're going to shoot the film, for example, in New York. And I didn't want to do that because I didn't want people to think, oh, okay, New York, 9/11 package. This very much is happening all across America. And in fact, I would say that some of the more liberal coastal cities might not necessarily see as much. But again, when it comes to sort of law enforcement and surveillance, I think it's happening everywhere.
Yeah. And on a different spectrum, one of the visual elements that I think you use as such an interesting tool throughout the film is playing around with the frame rate. And that was something that you very specifically did with your cinematographer. And what's extremely fascinating about that is you didn't just do it once or twice with exactly the same effect, but you really play with it in completely different ways in different
You
scenes.
noticed, aha, keen eye.
Yes. So how did the two of you work together to just figure out where you wanted to play around with it and what the different frame rates were going to be according to how you wanted to enhance the story in different ways?
It's funny, we're about to talk on it on an upcoming workshop with our release. Anthony and I have shot a few films together, and so we have a shorthand and we love doing homework. So we had a whole grid, character grid, and all the three arcs, 3 acts, and then the characters, and whose camera language needs to intersect with whose camera language. And for example, for Dua, like I said earlier, there was a certain frame rate for every time she went into a mosque or every time she went into her studio. And so these were kind of like subtle things that we wanted to do. And then there's more aggressive step printing, and the Wong Kar-wai, style of it was more for moments that really shook them. So yes, it was very intentional, and a lot of, we would have our notebooks every night and just literally calling out to each other, 32, 48, 24. Okay, we're going to do this. So it was shutter rate, it was frame rate, it was shutter speed, frame rate, all of those.
I also wanted to ask about the financing journey of this movie, because I know that there were so many hurdles and challenges. You raised the money once or twice and then it fell away both times. And then even when you finally raised the money and were going into production 10 days before, you ended up having some of the budget be lost again and only had the budget to shoot about 75% of the film. So when you're 10 days out, how do you suddenly start thinking about the structure and production schedule for the movie differently? Did you start reassessing some of the choices that you'd made and seeing if there was a different way to film it and still ensure that whether you got more funding again, that you were still going to get the film that you wanted on the other side of it?
Mara, you're so well researched. I think when your producers come to you, or your co-producers come to you just, a week before and say, we can only shoot 15 days and not the 19 or 20. That's a moment where you just kind of go back and you cry and then you lick your wounds and you're like, well, I have all these people. I have this fantastic actor flying in from Pakistan. I can't just like pause the film and, raise more money and do it. And so at that point, I really had to reach out and literally beg, borrow from family and friends and get loans to be able to have faith. And then, you have faith and then things come around. Like we won the Women in Film Finishing Fund Award. We won this, we won that. We have an incredible distributor with Impact Distribution. So really at the end of the day, Mara, I think as an artist, you have to have faith in what you're doing and things will work out. If you have faith that this will go through and this will ring true with the audience, it's a very lonely process because quite often you kind of are the only person who really believes in it to that extent. Sure, you inspire that faith with your team, but when moments like this happen, you kind of have to just make that decision on your own. And in that process, I didn't adjust much. We cut one day, and we piled on to the other days. But I reached out to friends and family for loans, and we finished the shoot.
That's so fantastic. And, one of the other infamous hurdles that this film went through was that it was set to premiere at South by Southwest, which, as we all know, ended up unfortunately being cancelled. But I was interested in how, having gone through self-distribution with some of your projects previously, was actually at that point a really beneficial tool, because, the entire landscape of the industry completely shifted. What does it mean to premiere at a festival? What does it mean to release your film online digitally? And even the answer to those questions were completely different April of last year than they are right now, as we've evolved everything within the entertainment industry. And so how was having that experience of self-distribution and knowing that you weren't just thinking about the decision in the moment or the financial success of this film, but the impact it would have on future projects that you were working on, really impact a lot of the decisions that you made when you had to change all of the plans that you had in place for this movie?
I will say that I'm very fortunate to have the scar tissue that I have. Quite often we sometimes, are sad that, oh, we didn't have that breakout Sundance hit, or we didn't have this. But, actually, I'm happy that this journey has had the struggles it has, because frankly, the only way we were able to pivot in this year was because of that scar tissue. Because unlike a lot of other independent filmmakers, I have a lot of knowledge on distribution, and because I've had to do it myself, right? And so just having the team and the sales, I at least I was the one who said, we can't just wait for another festival to pick us up, that they will pick us up and they will launch us. I said, what does that exactly? At the end of the day, for me, it's all about the audience. I think awards and festivals are great, and as long as they're giving you more opportunities, but at the end of the day, it's about going through that wall that is created between creators and audience, and how do we get there. And so I'm so proud that somebody like Adrian Becker of Level Forward stepped up and gave us the impact distribution that we could have had, as opposed to just dropping on the film and VOD and in the noise that exists in VOD. Because for me, after winning the Women in Film Finishing Fund, what I would have done is traveled the length and breadth of this country and interacted with the audience and use that as the really grassroots marketing. Because a film like this has a huge impact piece. So like with Level Forward, we have a night that's talking about race and surveillance, a night that's talking about immigrants and identity, rhythms of Pakistan, workshops, galas. And we're talking to people who are grounding what you see in this film in reality. For example, a lawyer who just won 9-0 at the Supreme Court, arguing in favor of Muslims who were put on no-fly lists by the FBI because they said they would not surveil their communities. To be able to get the opportunity to take your film and convert it into action that way. So we're doing that. We're doing corporate private screenings with arts action sessions. We are going to be on VOD as well. But to me, it's so much more than that. To me, it's about starting the conversations, creating impact, social change, and then the other projects follow. I often say this to filmmakers. It's like, if you've spent, 2, 3, 5 years making this film, spend another year getting it out there, because what's the point? For me, I want to make the art, of course, but the best part is to interact with others, learn from their reactions, and hopefully inspire them. So yes, it really helps me quite a bit. I was very upset. I was also going through postpartum. It was a very difficult period, but I licked my wounds, and honestly, like, I couldn't be happier right now, because we are not just being dropped on VOD. We've actually recreated our own mini South by for this film. We
And
have
with the
almost
impact,
2,000 people tuning in. I mean, it's incredible.
that's really, really remarkable. And in terms of the impact that the films had on you, you've mentioned that it really opened up a lot of vulnerability, but also a lot of emotional healing for you. What are the ways in which the journey of this film and making it has done that for you?
I mean, there's scenes in this film that, just came on the page uh, just as a writer. And then you see that happening in real life. And then you use real life to inspire your work. And at some point, you forget what is real and what isn't. And there are people on set coming to you and, crying and saying, this is too hard to see. And then you basically say, well, imagine for those people who have to live through this, right? So in a lot of ways, every film and every character that I write, and I'm fortunate to play with these or interact with actors, they just teach me so much about human emotion and how we evolve. And that's frankly why I became an artist. I love working with actors. I love sort of learning how to push buttons and getting emotions out. I also just realized that we're so much stronger than we know. I think the journey of making this film and the journey of the characters in this film really give me a greater understanding and respect for trusting the process and waiting a little more, but going further.
I'm so impressed by everything that you've achieved with this film. So congratulations with all of that. And thank you so much for this lovely conversation.
Thank you, Mara. It's been such a delight, especially to talk to somebody who is so passionate, such as yourself.